Good evening, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight we follow the remarkable life of Mark Twain, a riverboat pilot, humorist, and writer whose words helped shape American literature. Imagine a boy who grew up in a tiny town on the edge of the American frontier, a boy who left school for good at 11 years old, who never earned a diploma of any kind, and who spent his early years setting type in dusty printing shops for a few dollars a week. Imagine that same boy growing up to shake hands with presidents, to dine with kings, to become one of the most quoted writers in the English language, and to be called, by no less a judge than a president of the United States, the greatest American writer of his generation. Picture a young man who failed, more than once at nearly everything he tried. He failed as a prospector, digging for silver in the Nevada hills and finding nothing but dust and disappointment. He failed as a businessman, pouring a fortune into an invention that never worked, a machine that would eventually help push him into bankruptcy. He failed, by his own account, as a Confederate soldier, deserting after only a few weeks of half-hearted service. And yet this same man would go on to write two of the most beloved and enduring novels in American literature, would become the toast of London and Vienna and Berlin, and would leave behind a body of work so rich in wit and wisdom that people still quote him, often without knowing it, more than a century after his death. Consider a man who was born, quite by coincidence, in the same year that Halley's Comet blazed across the sky, and who predicted with the same dry humour that marked everything he said that he would go out with it too. He was right. The comet returned in 1910. He died the very next day after its closest approach. This is the story of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, a name the world would come to know by another name entirely, Mark Twain. It is the story of a riverboat pilot who lost his river to a war, a miner who never struck it rich, a journalist who learned to turn tall tales into literature, and a father who buried 3 of his 4 children and outlived the wife he loved for 34 years. It is a story of laughter used as armor against grief, of a keen eye turned on the follies of an entire nation, and of a voice so distinctly American that it helped an entire country learn how to hear itself speak. But to understand how a barefoot boy from a town of a few hundred people became the most famous writer in the world, we must go back to the beginning. Before we do, if you are enjoying this journey through history as a way to unwind and drift towards sleep, consider following along for more stories like this one. There is no need to do anything right now except settle in, breathe slowly and listen. Think for a moment about how strange fame is, how rarely it arrives in a straight line. Most of the people we now call great did not know, while they were living their ordinary days, that greatness was where they were headed. They simply kept working, kept failing, kept trying the next thing, and only much later, looking backward, does the pattern seem inevitable. Samuel Clemens's life offers one of the clearest illustrations of this truth in American history. There was no moment in his childhood when anyone, including the boy himself, could have pointed to him and said with confidence that here was a future literary giant. He was simply a boy on a river, restless and curious, doing what boys in small towns have always done, unaware that the world was quietly taking notes. Because this story does not begin in fame. It begins in a small, unremarkable house in Missouri, in a young nation still finding its own voice, in a family that had already known more loss than most families ever will. In the early 19th century, the United States was still a young and restless country, pushing steadily westward, its borders and identity still being drawn in the imaginations of people who called themselves pioneers. Missouri, admitted to the Union in 1821, sat at the edge of that expansion, a place where the settled East gave way to territory that still felt in many ways wild. The Mississippi River ran along its eastern border like a great muscular artery, carrying goods, ideas, and people between the growing cities of the north and the plantations of the south. It was a river that would, in time, come to mean everything to the man born nearby. Missouri in the 1830s was a slave state, though a divided one, sitting at the uneasy crossroads between northern and southern ways of life. It was a place of small farms and smaller towns, of log cabins and country stores, of families who worked hard and prayed hard and did not expect much from life beyond survival with dignity. It was into this world, in a village so small it barely existed on any map, that the Clemens family arrived. John Marshall Clemens, the father, was a lawyer and a merchant, a man of considerable ambition and considerable bad luck. He was tall, thin, and serious, a man who rarely laughed, and who carried himself with a certain formal dignity, even when his pockets were empty, which was often. He had a habit of investing in land that never paid off, of dreaming about fortunes that never arrived. Throughout his life he held onto a large tract of land in Tennessee, nearly 100,000 acres, convinced that one day it would make his family wealthy. It never did. That unfulfilled promise would hang over the Clemens household for decades, a phantom inheritance that shaped his children's sense that riches were always just around the corner and always just out of reach. Jane Lampton. Clemens, the mother, was his opposite in nearly every way. Where John was solemn, Jane was lively. She had a sharp wit, a fondness for storytelling, and a soft spot for stray animals and struggling people that never seemed to run dry. She was, by every account that survives her, warm in a way her husband was not, and it was from her that her most famous son would inherit his gift for talk, his sense of humour, and his tenderness beneath the humour. The couple had already lost children before the birth of the boy who had become world famous. Of the 7 children Jane Clemens bore, only 4 would live to adulthood. This was not unusual for the era, when childhood illness carried away sons and daughters with a regularity that modern listeners can barely imagine. But it left its mark on the family nonetheless. Grief was, from the very beginning, a quiet companion in the Clemens household, something to be endured rather than discussed, folded into daily life alongside chores and prayers and the constant search for money that never quite arrived. The family had settled, by 1835, in the small village of Florida, Missouri, a place so modest that it consisted of little more than a scattering of houses along Salt River. It was here, in a 2-room frame house, that on the night of November the 30th, 1835, Jane Clemens gave birth to a son. He arrived 2 months premature, small and sickly, so fragile that few in the household expected him to survive infancy. He was given the name Samuel after his father's father, and Langhorne in honour of a family friend. Nobody watching that difficult birth in that small house could have imagined that this frail infant, who spent his early months in constant danger of dying, would live to be 74 years old, would travel the globe, and would become perhaps the most recognisable American who ever lived. The naming of a comet would come later, and it deserves its place in this story now, briefly, as a kind of promise made at the very start. Halley's comet, the great icy traveller that swings past Earth roughly every 75 years, blazed across the sky in 1835, visible even to those without telescopes, a source of wonder and superstition throughout the world. Samuel Clemens was born just 2 weeks after its closest approach to the sun. He would joke, decades later, that he had come in with the comet and expected to go out with it. It was the kind of remark that sounded at the time like simple wit. It would prove, in the end, to be something closer to prophecy. For now, though, He was simply a small, sickly baby in a small, struggling household in a small town that could not support his father's ambitions. The house where he was born still stands today, moved and preserved, a modest reminder of how unlikely his beginnings truly were. Visitors who walk through its 2 small rooms often remark on how little space there was, how plain the furnishings must have been, how impossible it would have seemed on that November night that anyone born there might one day dine with emperors. John Marshall Clemens had come to Missouri from Virginia, by way of Kentucky and Tennessee, part of a broader migration of families moving steadily westward in search of opportunity that always seemed to recede just ahead of them. He had studied law, briefly, and carried himself with the bearing of a gentleman, even when his finances suggested otherwise. He served for a time as a local judge, a position that earned him the honorary title of Judge Clemens for the rest of his life, though the position paid little and satisfied his ambitions even less. He was a man who believed deeply in respectability, in appearances, in the idea that hard work and patience would eventually be rewarded, a belief that the family's repeated financial disappointments never quite managed to extinguish. Jane Lampton Clemens, for her part, had grown up in more comfortable circumstances in Kentucky before marrying John and following him into a life considerably harder than the one she had known as a girl. She never fully lost the manners and expectations of her more genteel upbringing, and something of that inherited refinement passed down to her children even amid the family's genuine poverty. She was known throughout her life for her sharp tongue, her fierce loyalty to her children, and an almost bottomless well of sympathy for anyone, human or animal, that she perceived as suffering. Neighbours recalled that she kept a house full of stray cats through much of her life, unable to turn away a hungry creature at her door, a trait her son would later recall with obvious affection and no small amount of gentle mockery in his writing. The Missouri into which Samuel Clemens was born was still very much frontier country, only recently carved from wilderness and native land, its towns small and scattered, its roads little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud in the rain. Steamboats had only begun to make the Mississippi a reliable commercial highway a decade or so earlier, and the world beyond the borders of the state remained, for most of its residents, a distant abstraction, known mainly through newspapers that arrived weeks late and through the occasional traveller passing through. It was a place where a person's reputation and word counted for a great deal, where church attendance was near universal, and where slavery, though present, was practiced on a smaller and more intimate scale than on the vast plantations of the Deep South, a fact that would later complicate rather than soften the moral questions Samuel Clemens would spend much of his career exploring. Within this world, the infant Samuel Langhorne Clemens struggled simply to survive his first years. He was so frail as a baby that Jane Clemens later said she scarcely dared hope he would live to see his second birthday, and stories passed down in the family suggested that for a time he was kept wrapped and warmed by the fire almost constantly, watched over with the particular anxious vigilance that parents who have already buried children learn to carry. That he survived at all, let alone thrived into the long and eventful life that followed, seemed to those closest to him almost a small miracle, one more quiet irony in a life that would come to be defined by unlikely turns. Within a few years the family would move again, this time to a town on the banks of the great river itself, a town that would give the boy his childhood, his imagination, and eventually his most beloved characters. That town was called Hannibal. When Samuel Clemens was 4 years old, his family packed their belongings and moved 30 miles east to Hannibal, Missouri, a small port town perched directly on the western bank of the Mississippi River. It was 1839, and Hannibal, though still young and rough around the edges, was beginning to grow into something more than a frontier outpost. Steamboats churned past its docks. Merchants and farmers brought goods to trade. The river itself, wide and brown and endlessly moving, was the town's lifeblood, its highway, its window onto the wider world. For a small boy with a restless imagination, Hannibal was close to paradise. The town sat among limestone bluffs riddled with caves, thick with forest, bordered by islands in the river that seemed built for adventure. Steamboats arrived several times a day, their whistles announcing their approach long before they came into view, and the whole town would turn out to watch them dock, a daily spectacle of smoke and noise and the promise of faraway places. To a boy raised in Hannibal, the river was not simply a body of water. It was the edge of the known world, and everything beyond its far bank was mystery. Samuel spent his childhood roaming this landscape with a pack of local boys, swimming in the river against his mother's wishes, exploring the caves outside of town and absorbing, without realizing it, the raw material that would one day become some of the most famous scenes in American literature. The games he played, the mischief he caused, the friends he ran with, all of it would resurface decades later in the adventures of two boys named Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. His health remained fragile through much of his early childhood. He was a sickly boy, prone to illness, and his mother later said that she despaired of raising him at all. She once remarked, with the dry humour her son would inherit, that she gave him medicine for so many ailments in his early years that it was a wonder any of it worked, since half the time the ailments were things she had simply guessed at. The family that surrounded young Samuel was, like most families of the era and region, entangled with the institution of slavery. John Clemens owned at least one enslaved person during parts of his life, and the extended family, along with much of the town, participated in and depended upon a system that treated human beings as property. This was the world into which Samuel Clemens was born, one where slavery was simply the unquestioned backdrop of daily life for a white child in Missouri. He would spend summers on his uncle's farm outside Hannibal, a place with several enslaved workers, and it was here that he formed one of the most important relationships of his childhood, with an elderly enslaved man the family called Uncle Dan'l. Uncle Dan'l told the young boy stories in the evenings, tales full of ghosts and folklore and moral lessons delivered with warmth and patience. Samuel Clemens would later say that this man's gentle character and his gift for storytelling left a permanent mark on him, and many scholars believe that Uncle Dan'l became, decades later, a partial inspiration for the character of Jim in what would become Twain's greatest novel. Even as a child surrounded by the casual cruelty of a slaveholding society, something in Samuel absorbed a different lesson from this particular man, a lesson about dignity and humanity that would eventually work its way, slowly and imperfectly, into his writing. Decades later, as an old man reflecting on his childhood, Clemens wrote that he had never encountered a finer character, a man of greater fidelity or purity of heart, than that enslaved man on his uncle's farm. A striking statement from someone raised within a system explicitly designed to deny such recognition to the very people it exploited. This contradiction, a boy absorbing genuine moral lessons about human dignity from within a household and a society that systematically denied that dignity to the people who taught him, would remain one of the central and unresolved tensions running through Clemens's life and work, one he would spend decades circling, most powerfully in the pages of Huckleberry Finn. The house the family occupied in Hannibal, a modest white frame building on Hill Street, has survived to the present day, preserved as a museum, and it remains one of the most visited literary landmarks in the United States. Nearby stood the homes of the real children who would later be transformed into fiction. A girl named Laura Hawkins, who lived across the street and became a lasting friend and, many believe, part of the inspiration for the character of Becky Thatcher, and a boy named Tom Blankenship, the son of the town drunkard, a barefoot, free-spirited child who answered to no one's rules and who Clemens later identified directly as the primary model for Huckleberry Finn. Clemens said of Tom Blankenship that he was the only truly independent person, of any age, that he had known in his childhood, free from the social pressures and hypocrisies that bound everyone else in the town, a freedom that fascinated the young Samuel, even as his own more respectable family kept a certain careful distance from the Blankenship household. Hannibal in these years was a town of roughly 1,000 residents, small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, yet large enough to support several churches, a scattering of shops, a courthouse, and the newspaper office where Samuel would eventually apprentice. The town's social life revolved heavily around religion, and the family attended a Presbyterian church with some regularity. Though Samuel's relationship with organized faith would grow steadily more skeptical and complicated as he aged, a skepticism that would surface sometimes gently and sometimes sharply throughout his later writing. The Mississippi River dominated everything. Boys swam in its currents despite the very real danger of drowning, a danger that claimed the lives of more than one of Samuel's childhood companions over the years, incidents that left the boy with an early and lasting awareness of how quickly a summer afternoon could turn to tragedy. He nearly drowned himself on several occasions, pulled under by currents stronger than he anticipated, saved each time by luck or by the quick action of an older companion. These brushes with death, recalled later with characteristic understatement, seemed to have left him with neither fear of the water nor any illusions about its danger, an attitude that mirrored, in miniature, the way he would approach risk throughout much of his adult life. Beyond the river, the boy explored the limestone caves outside of town with his friends, wandering through passages that could, and occasionally did, disorient even experienced local guides. One such cave, later opened commercially and still visited by tourists today under a name drawn directly from his fiction, provided the model for the cave in which Tom Sawyer and Becky Thatcher become lost, a sequence that terrified young readers for generations precisely because Clemens had once, as a boy, felt the genuine disorientation and quiet panic of losing his bearings underground. Death visited the family more than once during these Hannibal years. Samuel's younger sister Margaret died of a fever when he was still a small child. His younger brother Benjamin died a few years later, and then, when Samuel was not yet 12 years old, his father John Marshall Clemens caught pneumonia and died on a cold March day in 1847, leaving the family with almost nothing beyond debts and the unfulfilled promise of that Tennessee land. The loss changed everything. There was no money for school beyond the basics, and within months, young Samuel left formal education behind entirely. He was 11 years old. It would be the last time he ever sat in a classroom as a student. Everything he would come to know, the vast and eclectic knowledge that would later astonish readers around the world, he would teach himself, through reading, through observation, through the hardest kind of schooling there is, the schooling of necessity. His father's deathbed left one final haunting impression on the boy that he would recall for the rest of his life. According to family accounts, John Marshall Clemens, in his final delirium, called out for his eldest daughter and spoke of unfinished business regarding the Tennessee land, still clinging, even as death approached, to the dream of a fortune that had eluded him his entire life. Jane Clemens later said that her husband's last conscious act was to draw his son Samuel close and kiss him, an unusual display of open affection from a man who had rarely shown such tenderness in life, as though some final softness had broken through the formal reserve he'd maintained for so many years. Samuel Clemens rarely spoke of this moment directly in his later writing, but biographers have long noted how frequently themes of withheld affection, unfulfilled paternal promise, and children left to make their own way in the world would resurface throughout his fiction. He went to work almost immediately, first running errands and doing odd jobs to help support his mother and siblings, and then, within a year or two, apprenticing as a printer's devil at a local newspaper. It was here, standing at a composing stick and setting type letter by letter, that Samuel Clemens first encountered the world of words as a trade rather than simply a pleasure. He learned to read upside down and backward, setting type from a compositor's case, and in the process he absorbed grammar, spelling and rhythm in a way that no classroom could have taught him. He read everything that passed across his hands, newspapers from around the country, essays, stories, advertisements, absorbing the cadences of the English language from the inside out. The seeds of the writer he would become were being planted in these years, though nobody, least of all the boy himself, could have known it yet. He was, by his own later description, an ordinary mischievous boy, more interested in swimming and exploring than in any grand ambition. But something in him was watching, always watching, storing away the details of river life, the characters who passed through Hannibal, the particular music of Missouri speech, all of it accumulating quietly, waiting for the day it would be called upon. The newspaper office where he apprenticed belonged for a time to his own brother Orion, a well-meaning but chronically unlucky man who would spend much of his life drifting between failed business ventures, always a step behind the success that seemed to come more naturally to his younger brother. Working under Orion gave Samuel more freedom than a typical apprenticeship might have allowed, and he began, in these years, to experiment with writing short humorous items and squibs for the paper, small jokes and observations tucked between advertisements and local notices, an early and unglamorous training ground for the wit that would later make him famous. These years also brought him into contact with a broad and colourful range of Hannibal characters who would later resurface, transformed, in his fiction. Itinerant preachers, riverboat gamblers, drunkards, school teachers of varying competence, and the ordinary shopkeepers and farmers who made up the daily texture of small-town Missouri life. He absorbed their speech patterns, their superstitions, and their small dramas with the attentiveness of a natural observer, though at the time it would have seemed to anyone watching like nothing more than an idle boy listening to gossip on a porch or at a store counter. It was only decades later, when these same voices and stories re-emerged in his novels, that the true value of this unstructured, wandering education became apparent. He read whatever came within reach. Adventure stories, histories, the King James Bible, whose cadences would echo faintly throughout his later prose, even as his private religious faith grew more uncertain, and above all, newspapers from cities far larger than Hannibal, which offered him glimpses of a wider world he was determined, even as a boy, to someday see for himself. Public libraries, where he could access this reading material for free, became, in his own later description, more valuable to his education than any school he might otherwise have attended, a claim that reflected both genuine gratitude and a certain lifelong defensiveness about his lack of formal schooling, a gap he would spend the rest of his life quietly compensating for through relentless curiosity and self-directed learning. That day was still many years away. First, there would be more grief, more wandering, and an entirely different career, one that would give Samuel Clemens both his pen name and, in his own estimation, the two happiest years of his life. After his father's death, Samuel Clemens worked for several years as a printer, first in Hannibal, and then as a teenager, traveling to larger cities to find better opportunities in the trade. He worked in St. Louis, in New York City, in Philadelphia, setting type by day and reading voraciously by night, often in public libraries, which he later credited as a more valuable education than any school could have provided him. He sent letters home describing the wonders of the cities he visited, letters that already showed flashes of the humour and keen observation that would define his later writing. By his early 20s, restless and uncertain of his direction, he returned to the Mississippi River Valley, and it was there that he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life and, indirectly, give the world one of its most beloved literary names. In 1857, at the age of 21, Samuel Clemens apprenticed himself to a riverboat pilot named Horace Bixby, determined to learn the trade of navigating steamboats along the Mississippi. This was no small undertaking. Piloting a steamboat along the Mississippi required memorizing, in astonishing detail, every twist and turn of a river that never stayed the same for long. Sandbars shifted with the seasons. Snags and submerged trees appeared and disappeared. A pilot had to know the river as intimately as a person knows the rooms of their own home, in daylight and darkness, in fog and flood, upstream and downstream, for over 1,000 miles of winding water. It took Samuel roughly 2 years of intense study under Bixby's demanding tutelage before he earned his own pilot's license in 1859. He would later say that being a riverboat pilot was the best job he ever had, and that piloting taught him more about human nature than any other experience of his life, because a pilot met every kind of person who travelled the river, from the wealthiest planters to the poorest drifters, and had to read each of them as carefully as he read the water itself. It was, by his own account, work that combined danger, skill, freedom, and status, since a good pilot was one of the most respected and well-paid professionals of his era. It was also during his years on the river that Samuel Clemens first encountered the phrase that would become his pen name. Leadsmen on the riverboats called out the depth of water beneath the hull using a weighted marked line, and when the water measured 2 fathoms, or 12 feet, deep enough for safe passage, they called out Mark Twain, meaning the second mark on the line. It was a phrase that meant safety, that meant the boat could proceed without running aground. Samuel Clemens would not adopt it as his own name for several more years, but the river had already given him the words that would one day travel farther than any steamboat ever could. The training itself was grueling in ways that tested young Samuel more thoroughly than almost anything he had attempted before. Horace Bixby was a demanding and often impatient teacher, prone to sudden fits of temper when his young apprentice failed to recall some crucial detail of the river's ever-shifting geography. Clemens later wrote, with the vivid detail of a man who had clearly relived the memory many times, of the sheer terror of standing at the wheel in pitch darkness, expected to know from memory alone where a sandbar lurked beneath the black water, or where a fallen tree had settled into a channel that had looked entirely different only weeks before. A pilot who guessed wrong could tear the bottom out of a boat, drown passengers, and end his own career in a single miscalculated moment. There were moments, by his own later admission, when young Samuel came close to abandoning the effort entirely, convinced that he simply lacked the memory required to hold an entire river's shifting geography in his mind at once. Bixby, unmoved by such doubts, insisted that any competent pilot could and did perform exactly this feat, and that Clemens would too, given enough time and enough failures to learn from. It was, in its way, an early and formative lesson in persistence, one that Clemens would draw upon again during the leaner years that followed, when mining claims failed and manuscripts stalled and creditors circled. The same stubborn refusal to accept that a difficult thing was therefore an impossible one. Slowly, painstakingly the lessons took hold. Clemens later described the process of learning the river as being forced to learn a book that rewrote itself every single day, since the Mississippi's currents, sandbars and submerged hazards shifted constantly with rain, drought, and season. A pilot could not simply memorize the river once. He had to keep learning it, continuously, for as long as he wished to keep his license and his passengers alive. It was, Clemens later reflected, one of the purest and most demanding forms of expertise he ever encountered, one that left him with a permanent respect for anyone who had truly mastered a difficult and dangerous craft. There was tragedy woven into these years as well. Samuel had helped bring his younger brother Henry into the piloting trade, securing him a position as a mud clerk aboard a steamboat. In June of 1858, the boiler of that boat, the Pennsylvania, exploded catastrophically near Memphis, and Henry, badly scalded in the disaster, lingered in agony for several days before dying. Samuel, who had switched to a different boat only shortly before the explosion, was consumed by guilt for years afterward, believing, with the kind of harsh self-judgment he often turned upon himself even when circumstances were plainly beyond his control, that he might somehow have prevented his brother's death. It was a grief that echoed, in its shape, the grief that would return to him decades later with the death of his own children, an early lesson in the particular cruelty of surviving those one loves. For 2 years, Samuel Clemens piloted boats up and down the Mississippi, developing the eye for detail and character that would later fill his books with such vivid life. But this idyllic period would not last. In April of 1861, the outbreak of the Civil War brought commercial river traffic to a halt, and the piloting career that Clemens loved so deeply came to an abrupt end. He was 25 years old, and the profession he considered the finest work a man could do had simply vanished beneath him, swept away by a national catastrophe that would touch nearly every family in the country, including his own. What followed was a brief and, by his own later admission, rather unglamorous brush with the war itself. Clemens returned to Missouri and joined a small, informal Confederate militia unit made up of friends and neighbors, more a social club with rifles than a serious fighting force. The unit saw almost no real combat, spent much of its brief existence retreating and hiding rather than fighting, and after only about 2 weeks, Clemens simply walked away from it, disillusioned with the entire enterprise. He would later write a humorous account of this brief military career titled The Private History of a Campaign That Failed, treating the experience with the same self-deprecating humor he applied to most of his own shortcomings. Whatever his private feelings about the war and the divided loyalties of his home state, he chose not to fight in it any further. Missouri itself remained a bitterly divided state throughout the conflict, technically part of the Union, yet home to deep and often violent Confederate sympathies, and the guerrilla warfare that plagued the region during these years left Clemens, like many of his neighbors, uncertain which side truly represented safety or honor. His decision to walk away from his militia unit rather than continue fighting reflected in part a genuine and lasting discomfort with violence that would surface again decades later in his outspoken opposition to American military intervention abroad, a discomfort that sat somewhat uneasily alongside his own complicated Southern upbringing in a household that had, after all, once owned enslaved people. With the river closed and the war raging, Samuel Clemens needed a new direction entirely. His older brother Orion had recently been appointed secretary of the newly formed Nevada Territory, and he invited Samuel to come along as his assistant. In the summer of 1861, the two brothers set out by stagecoach for the American West, a journey of many weeks across plains and mountains, that would carry Samuel Clemens away from the river forever and toward the identity that would make him famous. He arrived in Nevada with almost nothing, still uncertain what he wanted from life, and what followed was a period of restless searching that would test him nearly to the breaking point before delivering him, almost by accident, to his true calling. The Nevada territory that Samuel Clemens entered in 1861 was a raw and unfinished place, alive with the fever of silver and gold. Prospectors poured into the region by the thousands, chasing rumours of fortune in the hard rock of the Comstock lode, and for a while Samuel Clemens caught the same fever that gripped nearly everyone around him. He tried his hand at mining, first for timber claims and then for silver, spending months in remote camps, digging and staking claims that never produced anything of real value. Year after year this pattern repeated itself. He would hear of a promising strike, rush to stake a claim, invest what little money and labour he had, and come away with nothing but blistered hands and disappointment. By age 26 he had failed at mining as thoroughly as his father had failed at land speculation decades earlier, and there must have been moments, alone in some rough Nevada camp with empty pockets, when the shadow of his father's unfulfilled dreams felt uncomfortably close. Lesser spirits might have given up entirely, returned home defeated, and settled into some safer, duller trade. But Samuel Clemens had one skill that no failed mining claim could take from him. He could write, and more importantly, he could make people laugh. He had, since his printing days, occasionally sent humorous letters and sketches to newspapers, and during his mining years, running short on funds and increasingly desperate, he began writing more seriously for the Territorial Enterprise, a newspaper based in Virginia City, Nevada. His pieces, full of exaggeration, tall tales, and biting wit, caught the attention of the paper's editors, and in 1862 he was offered a position as a full-time reporter. It paid modestly, but it paid regularly, which was more than his mining claims had ever managed. He accepted, not entirely by choice but by necessity, and it was this decision, born more of financial desperation than artistic ambition, that set him at last on the path toward the career that would define his life. It was here, at the Territorial Enterprise in February of 1863, that Samuel Langhorne Clemens signed a humorous travel letter with a new name for the very first time: Mark Twain. He borrowed the old riverboat phrase, the call that meant safe water, 12 feet deep, and made it his own. Whether he chose it out of nostalgia for his lost piloting career, or simply because it had a good rhythmic sound to it, historians still debate. But from that point forward, the name would travel farther than any of them could have imagined. His years as a Western journalist were his true apprenticeship as a writer. He covered territorial legislative sessions, wrote satirical sketches of local characters, and developed a style built on deadpan exaggeration. The tall tale delivered with a perfectly straight face, a tradition rooted in frontier storytelling, but sharpened, in his hands, into something new. He also got into more than one scrape during these years, including a near duel with a rival editor that he later claimed to have avoided only through clever bluffing, a story that, like many of his own tales, may have grown taller with each retelling. The mining camps themselves offered a rough education of their own. Clemens lived for stretches in canvas tents and crude cabins, sharing cramped quarters with fellow prospectors, eating whatever could be found or afforded, and enduring the isolation and boredom that filled the long stretches between moments of hope. He wrote later of the peculiar psychology of the mining fever, how a man could convince himself, against all evidence and all reason, that the very next shovelful of earth might contain the fortune that had eluded him for months, and how this same delusion, repeated across thousands of prospectors throughout the Nevada hills, kept the entire territory in a state of restless, hopeful, and largely fruitless motion. He and a partner did, for one brief and tantalizing moment, believe they had struck a genuinely valuable claim, a vein of ore that seemed to promise real wealth. Clemens later described, with his characteristic gift for finding the humour in his own disasters, how he left the claim briefly to attend to other business, only to return and discover that a legal technicality regarding the timing of claim registration had cost them the site entirely, handing the fortune to another party. It was the closest he ever came to the riches that so many prospectors dreamed of, and its loss, absurd and infuriating in roughly equal measure, became one of the stories he told and retold for the rest of his life, a small parable about the cruelty and comedy of chasing sudden wealth. By 1864, restless again and facing renewed financial trouble, Clemens left Nevada for San Francisco, continuing his newspaper work there while also beginning to write short stories and sketches for a wider audience. It was during a stay in a rough mining camp called Angel's Camp in California's Calaveras County that he first heard a story that would change the course of his career entirely, a folk tale about a jumping frog contest, gone wrong through a rival's trickery. Clemens wrote his own version of the tale titled Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog and sent it east for publication. It appeared in November of 1865 in a New York paper under the title The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, and it was, almost overnight, a sensation. Newspapers across the country reprinted it. Readers who had never heard the name Mark Twain before were suddenly repeating his jokes and his phrases. At the age of 29, after years of failed mining claims and modest newspaper wages, Samuel Clemens had, quite unexpectedly, become famous. His time in San Francisco during these years had not been without its own hardships, and it is worth pausing to consider just how close to real desperation he came before this sudden turn of fortune. He worked for a period as a reporter covering the police courts and the rougher corners of city life, an assignment that exposed him to considerable poverty and injustice, and he wrote pieces criticizing police mistreatment of Chinese immigrants that angered local authorities enough to nearly cost him his position entirely. He endured a period of genuine financial desperation during these months as well, at one point pawning valuables to cover his rent, coming closer to real destitution than most of his later admirers ever realized. It was, by his own later admission, one of the lowest points of his young adulthood, a season of doubt that makes the sudden arrival of fame with the frog story all the more striking in hindsight. It was also during these California years that Clemens began developing the skills of a public lecturer, a talent that would sustain him financially for the rest of his career and eventually make him one of the most sought-after platform performers in the English-speaking world. His first paid lecture, delivered in San Francisco in 1866 after a reporting assignment took him to the Sandwich Islands, what is now known as Hawaii, was a considerable risk, since failure would have meant a public and costly humiliation on top of his already precarious finances. Instead, it was a triumph. Standing before that first audience, Clemens discovered that he possessed a natural gift for timing, for the long, deliberate pause before a punchline, for an appearance of complete seriousness that made his jokes land all the harder when they finally arrived. This discovery would prove just as important to his eventual fame as his writing itself, since for decades afterward, lecture tours would provide him with income, exposure, and, during his later financial troubles, a genuine lifeline back towards solvency. But fame from a single short story was not yet a career, and Clemens understood that he needed to build on this sudden attention if it was to mean anything lasting. The path forward, as it turned out, would take him across an ocean and would give him the material for the book that would truly launch him into the front rank of American writers. Before continuing with the story of his rising fame, it is worth pausing to consider who Samuel Clemens actually was as a person during these years and the ones that followed, because the public figure of Mark Twain, the platform performer and celebrated author, was in many ways a persona built carefully atop a more complicated private man. Physically, Clemens was of medium height, with a mass of curling reddish-brown hair that turned brilliantly white as he aged, thick eyebrows that seemed to have a life of their own, and piercing blue-grey eyes that friends described as capable of both great warmth and sudden sharp scrutiny. In later life, his white hair and thick white moustache, combined with his habit of wearing pale cream-coloured linen suits regardless of the season, gave him an instantly recognisable appearance, almost theatrical in its effect, which he cultivated quite deliberately. He understood, long before modern celebrities learned the lesson, the value of a distinctive public image. Friends and journalists who interviewed him over the decades often remarked on the particular quality of his voice, a slow, deliberate Missouri drawl that never fully left him, despite his years of travel and residence among more polished Eastern and European society. He spoke, much as he wrote, in carefully measured rhythms, and those who heard him lecture often said that the printed transcripts of his speeches, however faithfully reproduced, could never capture the full effect of hearing him deliver the words aloud, pausing exactly as long as necessary before the turn of a joke, letting silence do as much work as language. He was by nearly every account a man of habits both charming and exasperating to those who lived with him. He smoked cigars almost constantly, often a dozen or more a day, a habit he joked about frequently and refused to abandon despite occasional attempts. He worked best late at night and rose late in the morning, a schedule that occasionally frustrated his more conventional family members. He had a fondness for playing pool, for card games, and for elaborate practical jokes, and friends often remarked on how his private conversation was every bit as witty and quotable as his published writing, delivered in the same slow, deliberate Missouri drawl, with perfectly timed pauses before the punchline. He was also, beneath the humour, a man prone to deep and sometimes debilitating depression, particularly in later years, and a man plagued throughout his life by financial anxiety, despite periods of considerable wealth. Money seemed to slip through his hands regardless of how much he earned, whether poured into failed inventions or simply spent with the same generous impulsiveness that marked much of his personality. In 1870, at the age of 34, Samuel Clemens married Olivia Langdon, known to friends and family as Livy, the cultured, gentle daughter of a wealthy coal merchant from Elmira, New York. Their courtship had been, by his own account, a long and determined pursuit on his part, and their marriage would become the great, steadying relationship of his life. He had first seen a miniature portrait of Livy, carried by her brother Charles Langdon, a fellow passenger aboard the Quaker City during the very voyage that produced Innocents Abroad, and Clemens later claimed, with his usual flair for embellishing a good story, that he had fallen in love with the image before ever meeting the woman herself. Their actual courtship, once he returned to America and sought her out, proceeded slowly and was met with real skepticism from her family, who regarded the rough-mannered Western journalist as an uncertain match for their carefully raised daughter. Clemens proposed at least once and was refused before Livy finally accepted him, and even then her father insisted on writing to references throughout Clemens's past, including former employers and acquaintances in Nevada and California, seeking assurance that this reportedly brilliant but unpredictable young man could be trusted with his daughter's future. Not all of the references that came back were flattering, but Livy's own conviction ultimately won out over her family's reasonable caution. Their wedding took place in February of 1870 in Elmira, and the couple's early married life together, first in Buffalo and then in Hartford, gave Clemens something he had rarely known before: a stable, loving home built around genuine partnership. Livy read every manuscript he produced before it went to a publisher, and her editorial judgment, gentle but firm, shaped his work in ways he acknowledged gratefully throughout his career. Friends often remarked that Clemens seemed to seek her approval on both his writing and his behaviour with an eagerness that surprised those who knew him only as a supremely confident public performer, and he referred to her, in letters throughout their marriage, with a tenderness that stood in sharp contrast to his famously sharp public wit. Livy was more reserved and more conventionally refined than her husband, and she served throughout their marriage as something between an editor and a moral compass for his writing, softening his rougher edges and helping shape his manuscripts before they reach publishers. He often said with evident sincerity beneath the joking tone that she had civilized him. The couple settled first in Buffalo, New York, and then, in 1874, moved into an elaborate and eccentric mansion they had built in Hartford, Connecticut, a house full of turrets, verandas, and ornate woodwork that reflected both their wealth and Clemens's flamboyant taste. It was here, in a specially built study, that he wrote much of his most famous later work, often reading passages aloud to his family in the evenings, testing jokes and scenes on his wife and daughters before sending manuscripts off to his publisher. The Hartford house itself deserves a moment of attention, since it became, in many ways, a physical expression of Clemens's personality. Playful, ornate, a little excessive, and entirely unlike anyone else's home in the neighbourhood, designed with input from a prominent architect and decorated in part by the famed design firm associated with Louis Comfort Tiffany, the house featured a striking exterior of patterned brickwork, a wraparound porch resembling the deck of a steamboat, complete with a similar view over the surrounding grounds, and a grand central hall with a staircase that Clemens loved to descend dramatically when greeting guests. He often said the house was like a person to him, with a heart, a mind, and a temper of its own, and he grieved its loss after the family's financial troubles and Susie's death forced its sale, almost as though he had lost a living companion. The couple had 4 children. Their first, a son named Langdon, was born prematurely in 1870 and died before his 2nd birthday, a loss that haunted Clemens for the rest of his life, as he privately blamed himself for an incident in which the boy caught a chill during a carriage ride. 3 daughters followed: Susie, born in 1872, Clara, born in 1874, and Jean, born in 1880. Clemens adored his daughters with an openness that surprised many who knew him only through his public wit, writing them elaborate stories, inventing games, and delighting in their company in ways that softened, for those close enough to see it, the sharper edges of his public persona. His social life, particularly in Hartford, was rich and full. He counted among his close friends the writer William Dean Howells, one of the most influential literary figures of the era, who edited and championed much of Clemens's work, and the two carried on a decades-long correspondence full of both literary discussion and easy, affectionate humour. Clemens was a popular figure on the lecture circuit as well, delighting audiences across America and, eventually, around the world, with his slow, dry, perfectly timed platform style, a performance craft he developed with the same care he brought to his writing. Beneath the celebrated public figure, though, ran a deep well of restlessness and at times real anguish, fed by financial worry, by the grief of losing his son, and later by grief still to come. It was this combination, the brilliant public wit balanced atop private sorrow, that gave his writing much of its particular depth. He was, as one friend observed, a man who made the whole world laugh while nursing a heart that often ached. His writing routine, once he settled into it, was remarkably disciplined despite his generally unhurried public image. He preferred to write in the mornings and early afternoons, often in a small octagonal study built apart from the main house in Elmira, New York, where the family spent summers at Livy's family estate. The study, perched on a hill with a view of the valley below, had windows on nearly every side, and Clemens joked that it resembled the pilot house of a steamboat, a comparison that likely pleased him more than he let on, given how much he missed his old profession. He wrote in longhand at first, later becoming one of the earliest American authors to submit a typewritten manuscript to a publisher, a small but telling detail about his lifelong fascination with new machinery and technology, the same fascination that would later prove so costly in the case of the typesetting machine. Summers at that Elmira study were, by most accounts, the most productive stretches of his entire career. It was there, working in relative isolation with only the distant sounds of his children playing on the lawn below to interrupt him, that he completed the bulk of Tom Sawyer, Life on the Mississippi, and Huckleberry Finn, often emerging in the evenings to read the day's pages aloud to Livy and the girls, gauging their reactions carefully and revising accordingly. He treated these family readings almost as a testing ground, trusting his daughter's honest laughter or their honest silence, as reliably as he trusted any professional critic, and more than one passage that failed to earn a laugh at the family table was quietly cut before the manuscript ever left the house. He was known among friends for a booming, infectious laugh, and for a habit of pacing while he talked, gesturing with his cigar, building toward a punchline with the same careful architecture he brought to his written prose. Visitors to the Hartford house often remarked that dinner conversation with Clemens felt like witnessing a performance, though those closest to him insisted the wit was entirely natural, not rehearsed, an inseparable part of how his mind simply worked. He loved games of all kinds, invented an elaborate history-based board game to teach his daughters historical dates, played billiards late into the night with friends and guests, and maintained a lifelong fondness for cats, keeping several at a time throughout his adult life, often giving them deliberately absurd names that made his daughters laugh. Despite his public image as a folksy humorist, Clemens read voraciously and widely throughout his life, corresponded with scientists and inventors, and took a serious interest in emerging technology, becoming, for instance, one of the first private telephone subscribers in Hartford. He was in many ways a man caught between the world of his frontier childhood and the rapidly modernizing nation his adult life inhabited, and this position gave him a unique vantage point from which to observe, and often gently mock, the anxieties and pretensions of a country rushing toward the 20th century. With this fuller portrait of the man in mind, we return now to the story of his rising literary career, which began, in earnest, with a journey across the sea. In 1867, riding the wave of attention brought by the Jumping Frog story, Samuel Clemens secured a position as a travelling correspondent aboard a ship called the Quaker City, which was undertaking an extended pleasure cruise through Europe and the Holy Land, one of the first organised tourist excursions of its kind. His task was to write humorous dispatches back to American newspapers, describing the journey and his fellow passengers. What he produced was something more ambitious than simple travel journalism. Clemens turned his sharp eye not only on the famous sights of the Old World, but on his own fellow American tourists, gently mocking their provincial expectations, their reverence for guidebooks, and their frequent inability to see what was actually in front of them rather than what they had been told to see. The dispatches were wildly popular, and in 1869 he compiled and expanded them into his first major book, titled The Innocents Abroad. The book was an immediate and substantial success, selling far better than most travel narratives of the era, and establishing Clemens, now writing consistently under the name Mark Twain, as a genuine literary force rather than a passing newspaper sensation. It was witty, irreverent toward pretension of every kind, and yet genuinely curious and observant about the world it described, a combination that would come to define his mature style. The success of The Innocents Abroad gave Clemens the confidence and financial footing to marry Olivia Langdon the following year and to begin building the domestic life described earlier. But it also set expectations. Readers now wanted more from Mark Twain, and over the following decade he worked steadily to deliver it, publishing Roughing It in 1872, a semi-fictionalized account of his Western adventures during the mining years, and collaborating with Charles Dudley Warner on a satirical novel called The Gilded Age in 1873, a book whose title would eventually give an entire era of American history its name. So precisely did it capture the greed and speculation of the period. But it was in 1876, with the publication of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, that Clemens truly began mining the material of his own Hannibal childhood, transforming the boys and river and small-town characters of his youth into enduring fiction. Tom Sawyer, the mischievous, imaginative boy at the centre of the novel, was drawn substantially from Clemens's own memories of himself, and the town of St. Petersburg in the novel was, in all but name, Hannibal itself. The book was warmly received, beloved for its nostalgic sunlit portrait of American boyhood, its whitewashed fence, its cave adventures, its treasure hunts. It was a secondary character in that novel, however, a rough, uneducated but fiercely independent boy named Huckleberry Finn, who would eventually carry Clemens to his greatest literary achievement. He began writing a novel centered on Huck almost immediately after finishing Tom Sawyer, but the project stalled repeatedly over the following years. He set the manuscript aside for long stretches, uncertain how to finish it, distracted by other projects, by lecture tours, by mounting financial concerns as he poured money into various business ventures, including publishing companies and, most disastrously, an automatic typesetting machine that consumed a fortune and never worked reliably. For nearly 8 years, the manuscript of what would become Adventures of Huckleberry Finn sat incomplete, its author uncertain how the story should end, wrestling privately with material far darker and more morally complex than anything in its predecessor. When he finally returned to it in earnest in the early 1880s, drawing on a trip back down the Mississippi that reconnected him powerfully with the river and its people, he found his way to a conclusion, and in 1884 the novel was published in England, followed by American publication in the early 1885. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn would come to be regarded by countless critics and readers across the following century as Clemens's masterpiece, and by many as one of the greatest novels ever written in the American language. Ernest Hemingway would later say that all modern American literature comes from one book, and that book is Huckleberry Finn. The novel follows Huck, a boy escaping an abusive father, and Jim, a man escaping slavery, as they raft down the Mississippi together, and beneath its adventure story surface, it delivers a sustained and devastating critique of slavery, of hypocrisy, and of the moral compromises ordinary people make to justify cruel systems. The book was revolutionary in ways that went beyond its subject matter. Clemens wrote much of it in vernacular dialect, capturing the actual rhythms and grammar of the way people from the Mississippi Valley truly spoke, rather than the formal, literary English that dominated respectable fiction of the era. This was, at the time, a genuinely radical choice, one that many critics initially dismissed as crude or vulgar. Some libraries banned the book upon publication, objecting to its rough language and its unflattering portrait of respectable society. And yet it was precisely this commitment to authentic American speech and to an unflinching, humane portrayal of a black man's humanity at a time when such portrayals were rare in mainstream literature that gave the novel its enduring power. Growing recognition of the book's importance came gradually over subsequent decades, as it moved from controversial bestseller to recognized masterpiece, studied in schools and universities, translated into dozens of languages, and cited by later writers as a foundational influence on the development of a distinctly American literary voice. Clemens himself, at the time of publication, likely did not fully grasp that he'd written a book that would still be read and debated more than a century later. He simply knew he had finally finished the hardest and most personally meaningful project of his writing life. The writing of Huckleberry Finn had not been easy, and the difficulty went beyond simple distraction. Clemens later admitted in letters to friends that he struggled for years to find the proper ending, uncertain how to resolve the moral weight of Jim's situation without betraying either the honesty of the story or the expectations of a popular audience still primarily interested in boyhood adventure. The solution he eventually settled upon, involving an elaborate and comic scheme cooked up by Tom Sawyer to rescue Jim from a captivity that a more direct and honest approach could have ended far sooner, has itself been debated by critics for generations, some arguing that the ending's return to broad comedy undercuts the novel's serious moral achievements, others defending it as a deliberate and pointed satire of how even well-meaning white society preferred games and spectacle to genuine justice. Public reaction upon publication was sharply divided. While many readers and reviewers celebrated the novel's humour, its vivid characters, and its authentic capture of American vernacular speech, others were scandalized by its rough language, its unflattering depiction of respectable society, and its central relationship between a white boy and an escaped enslaved man, presented with a warmth and moral seriousness that many white readers of the 1880s found genuinely unsettling. The Concord Public Library in Massachusetts famously banned the book within months of its American publication, declaring it trash, suitable only for the slums, a condemnation that Clemens, with his usual gift for turning criticism into publicity, claimed would likely double his sales. He was not entirely joking. The controversy, if anything, only heightened public curiosity about the book. Alongside these two towering achievements, Clemens continued to produce a remarkable range of other work during these productive middle years. He wrote The Prince and the Pauper in 1881, a historical novel set in Tudor England exploring themes of identity and social class through a story of two boys who swap places, one a prince and one a beggar. He published Life on the Mississippi in 1883, part memoir and part travelogue, returning to the river of his youth to document both his own piloting years and the changes that had overtaken the river trade in the decades since steamboats had given way, in large part, to railroads. And in 1889 he published A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, a satirical fantasy that transported a 19th-century American engineer back in time to medieval England, using the collision between modern technology and ancient superstition to comment, often quite pointedly, on the follies of both eras. This last novel, humorous on its surface, grew increasingly dark and violent as it progressed, ending in a scene of mass technological slaughter that many later readers found strikingly prescient of the mechanized warfare that would engulf the 20th century, an early hint of the more pessimistic themes that would come to dominate Clemens's writing in his final years. With Huckleberry Finn behind him, Samuel Clemens stood, in his early 50s, at the height of his literary powers and his public fame. But the years ahead would bring both further triumph and profound hardship, testing the resilience that had carried him from a failed prospector to a celebrated novelist. Despite the enormous literary success of his novels, Samuel Clemens struggled throughout much of his adult life with money, a struggle rooted partly in his own restless ambition and partly in a genuine fascination with new technology and business opportunity that repeatedly outran his judgment. One venture, at least, brought genuine if temporary success before the larger financial collapse arrived. In 1884, Clemens founded his own publishing company, Charles L. Webster and Company, named for his nephew by marriage who served as its manager, and used it to publish Huckleberry Finn himself, rather than relying entirely on outside publishers. The company achieved its greatest triumph the following year when it secured the rights to publish the memoirs of former President Ulysses S. Grant, who was dying of throat cancer and desperately needed to secure his family's financial future before the end. Clemens negotiated generous terms for Grant, terms far better than rival publishers had offered, driven partly by shrewd business sense and partly by genuine personal admiration for the former general and president. Grant finished dictating and revising the manuscript just days before his death in July of 1885, and the resulting memoirs became an enormous bestseller, earning Grant's widow several $100,000 in royalties, a triumph that Clemens counted among the proudest accomplishments of his business career, and one that briefly made his publishing company look like a genuinely sound enterprise. Clemens later said that securing dignity and financial security for the dying Grant, a man he had long admired as one of the great figures of the Civil War era, ranked among the achievements of his life he was proudest of, separate entirely from his own literary accomplishments. It was, in its own way, a continuation of the same instinct for fairness and personal honour that would later drive him to repay his creditors in full, rather than simply declaring bankruptcy and walking away, a thread of principle that ran consistently through decisions that otherwise looked, on the surface, like ordinary business dealings. That early success, however, would not be sustained. The most consuming and ultimately most damaging of these ventures was his investment in the Page typesetting machine, an enormously complex mechanical device designed to automate the process of setting type, potentially revolutionizing the printing industry. Clemens, who had begun his working life as a typesetter and understood the tedium of the manual process intimately, became convinced that this machine represented the future, and he poured what would amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars into its development over more than a decade, money that came from his book royalties, from Livy's family fortune, and from continued borrowing. The machine was a marvel of engineering ambition, containing thousands of individual parts and capable, in theory, of setting type far faster than any human compositor. But it was also maddeningly unreliable, prone to constant breakdowns, and never successfully brought to market before a rival. Simpler technology, the linotype machine, captured the industry instead. By the early 1890s, the investment had become a sinkhole that Clemens could not escape, and combined with losses from his own publishing company, which he had founded partly to publish his own works and partly to control his own financial destiny, the family's finances collapsed entirely. In 1894, at the age of 58, Samuel Clemens declared bankruptcy. It was a humiliating reversal for a man who had, for years, lived in considerable style, and it forced significant changes on the family. Rather than simply discharging his debts through the legal bankruptcy process and moving on, as he was legally entitled to do, Clemens made a decision that reflected his deep and abiding sense of personal honor. He resolved to pay back every creditor in full, even debts the law would have forgiven him. To accomplish this, he embarked, at nearly 60 years old, on an exhausting round-the-world lecture tour, travelling to Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and numerous stops in between, performing his celebrated platform lectures night after night to paying audiences, enduring difficult travel conditions and considerable physical strain in the process. The tour was a triumph, both artistically and financially. His reputation, it turned out, preceded him to every corner of the globe he visited, and audiences everywhere greeted him with the enthusiasm of long-time admirers. The tour itself, chronicled afterward in a travel book titled Following the Equator, took a genuine physical toll on a man already past his 60th birthday. He suffered from carbuncles, a painful skin infection, during portions of the journey, endured stifling heat in India and rough sea crossings between continents, and performed night after night despite genuine exhaustion, because every performance meant another payment toward the debts he was determined to clear. Livy and their daughter Clara accompanied him for much of the journey, providing companionship and support, though even their presence could not fully offset the strain of such relentless travel and performance obligations at his age. Within about 4 years of relentless work, combining lecture income with continued book royalties and careful financial management undertaken with the help of a devoted friend and financial advisor, Clemens succeeded in paying back every dollar he owed, a feat that earned him enormous public admiration and was widely covered in the press of the era as a demonstration of extraordinary personal integrity. Here was a man who had lost a fortune through his own poor business judgment, yet who refused to take the easy legal exit available to him, choosing instead the harder path of complete repayment, whatever the personal cost. This period of financial recovery and worldwide travel, while professionally triumphant, extracted a heavy personal toll, and it was during this very tour, far from home, that the family would suffer the first of several devastating losses that would darken the final years of Samuel Clemens's life. In August of 1896, while Samuel Clemens and his wife Livy were in England, having completed the exhausting round-the-world lecture tour, word reached them of a tragedy back home. Their eldest daughter, Susie, 24 years old and considered by many who knew the family to be the most brilliant and promising of the Clemens children, had contracted spinal meningitis while staying at the family home in Hartford, apart from her parents. She died within days before her father and mother could return across the ocean to be at her side. The loss devastated Clemens in a way from which those closest to him said he never fully recovered. Susie had shared, more than his other children, his intellectual curiosity and literary sensibility, and he had corresponded with her extensively, delighting in her insights and her wit. Her death, occurring while he was far away and unable to reach her in time, introduced a permanent undercurrent of grief into his remaining years, one that his public humour increasingly worked to conceal rather than express. The family, no longer able to bear living in the Hartford house so filled with memories of Susie, sold the beloved mansion and settled into a period of restless residence in Europe, moving between Vienna, London and other cities, partly for reasons of finance and partly, it seems, from a simple inability to return to the place where their daughter had died. In Vienna, where the family lived for an extended period in the late 1890s, Clemens found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, one of the most celebrated literary figures in the city, courted by aristocrats and intellectuals alike, granted rare audiences and honours typically reserved for European nobility. Yet even amid this considerable social success, letters from these years reveal a man whose private grief remained close to the surface, who found himself unable to write about Susie directly for a long time afterward, and who leaned ever more heavily on his remaining family and closest friends to carry him through the quiet hours when the public performances ended. Clemens continued to write and lecture during these years, but friends and family increasingly noted a darker, more pessimistic strain entering both his private conversation and his published work, a growing preoccupation with human cruelty, hypocrisy, and the fragility of happiness. Clemens's grief over Susie found one of its most lasting expressions in his private writing, some of which he chose not to publish during his lifetime. He worked, in fits and starts over the following years, on what would eventually be assembled as his autobiography, a sprawling, unconventional project he dictated rather than wrote by hand in his final years, jumping freely between memories rather than following any strict chronological order, a method he found suited the way memory itself actually worked. He specifically requested that large portions of this manuscript remain unpublished for a full century after his death, believing that only such distance would free him to write with complete honesty about people still living and about his own private failings, without fear of causing pain or scandal to those who might read it too soon. Further grief followed. His daughter Jean, the youngest of the family, had begun experiencing epileptic seizures in her teenage years, a condition that would trouble her for the rest of her life, and that medicine of the era could do little to effectively treat. The family sought various treatments across Europe, moving from city to city partly in search of doctors who might help her, without lasting success. And then, in June of 1904, while the family was staying in Florence, Italy, in yet another attempt to find a climate that might benefit Jean's health and Livy's own increasingly fragile constitution, Olivia Langdon Clemens died. She had suffered for years from heart problems that had grown steadily worse, and Clemens had watched, largely helpless, as the woman who had been his closest companion, editor, and steadying influence for 34 years slipped away from him. He was 68 years old, and by his own account in letters to friends, he felt that the best part of his own life had ended with hers. The losses continued to accumulate in these final years. His daughter Jean, despite periods of hopeful improvement, would eventually die as well, on Christmas Eve of 1909, found in her bathtub after apparently suffering a seizure and drowning at the family's home in Redding, Connecticut. Clemens, by this point 74 years old and himself in failing health, was left with only one surviving child, his daughter Clara, who had married a Russian pianist and built a life somewhat separate from her father's household. Throughout these accumulating sorrows, Samuel Clemens continued to write, though the work of these final years grew markedly darker in tone than the sunlit adventures of Tom Sawyer, or even the morally serious but ultimately hopeful Huckleberry Finn. He produced pessimistic philosophical writings questioning free will and human nature, satirical essays growing increasingly bitter toward organized religion, imperialism, and the injustices he observed in American and world affairs, and fragments of fiction exploring themes of despair and cosmic indifference that he mostly declined to publish during his lifetime, aware perhaps that they sat uneasily alongside the beloved humorous persona the public expected of him. These later years also brought Clemens into open and often fierce public conflict, a marked change from the gentler satire of his younger years. He became a vocal and increasingly outspoken critic of American imperialism, particularly condemning United States military intervention in the Philippines following the Spanish-American War, and he served for a time as vice president of the American Anti-Imperialist League, lending his considerable fame to a cause that put him at odds with many in the political and business establishment who had once counted themselves among his admirers. He wrote scathing essays condemning brutal colonial exploitation in the Congo Free State under Belgian rule, using his sharpest satirical tools to expose atrocities that many respectable newspapers of the era preferred to ignore. This willingness to challenge powerful interests earned him both admiration and hostility. Some newspapers that had once celebrated him as America's beloved humorist now accused him of disloyalty or excessive pessimism, uncomfortable with a national icon turning his wit towards such serious and uncomfortable subjects. Clemens, characteristically, seemed largely undeterred by the criticism, continuing to publish his political essays even when friends and publishers urged him towards safer, more purely comic material that would better protect his popular reputation and his still recovering finances. He accepted the discomfort this caused, seemingly convinced that his fame carried with it an obligation to speak plainly about injustice, whatever the cost to his popularity. He maintained, even amid this private darkness and this new public combativeness, his celebrated public wit, continuing to lecture and to charm audiences and journalists with his slow drawl and perfectly timed observations. He had by this point become something more than simply a famous author. He was a beloved national institution, instantly recognizable in his white suits, with his shock of white hair, a living embodiment of a certain idea of American humor and wisdom. But those who knew him well understood that beneath the performance, a deep weariness and grief had settled permanently over the man who had once written so joyfully of boyhood summers on the Mississippi. As his own health began to decline in these final years, troubled by heart problems of his own, Clemens seemed to sense, with the same wry acceptance he had brought to so much of his life, that his own time was drawing to a close, and that it was drawing to a close in a manner that fit, with an almost eerie symmetry, the strange promise he had made decades earlier about the comet that had accompanied his birth. By 1909, Samuel Clemens, now 73 years old, had settled into his final home, a house he called Stormfield in Redding, Connecticut, named partly in honor of a fictional character he'd created, and partly as a wry commentary on the storms, both literal and figurative, that had marked so much of his later life. He lived there with a small household staff and for a time with his daughter Jean, whose death that Christmas Eve would leave him profoundly and finally alone among his immediate family. His health had been declining for some time. He suffered from angina, a painful heart condition that caused him considerable discomfort, and his doctors urged him toward rest and quiet, advice that a man of his restless temperament found difficult to fully embrace. He continued, even in these final months, to receive visitors, to correspond with friends, and to maintain something of his old wit, though those who saw him during this period noted how much frailer he had become, how the once vigorous figure had grown thin and slow. At Stormfield, Clemens spent his remaining days surrounded by a household that tried, as best it could, to balance his doctor's orders for rest with his own restless need for company and conversation. He still enjoyed playing billiards, though for shorter stretches than before, and he continued to dictate portions of his autobiography to a secretary during his better mornings, still working, even at the edge of life, in the manner he had worked for the better part of 6 decades. Visitors during these final months described him as thinner and more subdued than the vigorous public figure they remembered from earlier tours and lectures, yet still capable, in flashes, of the old wit, still able to deliver a perfectly timed remark that reminded everyone present why the world had loved him for so long. He had spoken for years, in letters and in conversation, about his birth under Halley's Comet and his conviction, offered with characteristic dry humour, but perhaps also with a genuine private sense of destiny that he would die when the comet returned. In 1909, astronomers confirmed that the comet was indeed due to make its closest approach to Earth in the spring of 1910. Clemens's health, declining steadily through the final months of 1909 and into the early months of 1910, seemed, to those around him, to be tracking an almost impossible parallel course with the comet's own approach. By April of 1910, Clemens was confined largely to his bed at Stormfield, his heart condition having worsened considerably. His daughter Clara, along with a small circle of close friends, and his devoted biographer and assistant Albert Bigelow Payne, gathered at the house, understanding that the end was near. Halley's comet reached its closest approach to Earth, its perihelion, on April 20th, 1910, blazing once again across the night sky, as it had on the night of Samuel Clemens's birth nearly 75 years earlier. On the following day, April 21st, 1910, with the comet still visible in the evening sky, Samuel Langhorne Clemens died at Stormfield at the age of 74. He had, as he predicted decades before with a joke that turned out to carry more truth than either he or his listeners had likely believed, come in with the comet and gone out with it as well. His daughter Clara later wrote that in his final hours he drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally reaching for a pencil and paper by his bedside, the old habit of a lifelong writer persisting even at the very edge of death, though the words he managed to set down in those last hours were fragmentary and largely illegible. News of his death spread rapidly around the world, appearing in newspaper headlines across America and Europe within hours. The scale of public mourning reflected just how thoroughly Samuel Clemens, writing under the name Mark Twain, had become woven into the fabric of American cultural life. Tributes poured in from writers, statesmen, and ordinary readers alike, many of them noting, with a kind of quiet astonishment, the remarkable symmetry of his birth and death, bookended by the same wandering comet. In the days immediately following his death, newspapers around the country ran extensive retrospectives of his life, many of them dwelling at length on the comet coincidence, treating it with a mixture of genuine wonder and gentle skepticism, since Clemens himself had made the prediction so many times, in so many different forms, that some obituary writers wondered whether he had simply willed the timing into being through sheer force of habit and repetition. Others took it more seriously, noting that Clemens had studied astronomy with real interest in his later years, and had spoken about the comet's return with an odd, calm certainty that struck those who heard him as more than simple joking. Whatever the explanation, the symmetry of his birth and death, bound together by the same wandering ball of ice and dust, became one of the most enduring and frequently repeated details of his biography, told and retold by admirers for generations afterward. His funeral was held on April 24th, 1910, at the Brick Presbyterian Church in New York City, a solemn and dignified service attended by a large gathering of friends, family and admirers, reflecting both the personal affection he had inspired and the towering public stature he had achieved. Afterward, his body was brought to Elmira, New York, the hometown of his beloved late wife Livy, where he was laid to rest in the Langdon family plot at Woodlawn Cemetery, beside Livy herself and their children Langdon, Susie, and eventually Jean, who would be brought there as well. Clara, his one surviving child, would in time be buried there too, reuniting, at least in the quiet ground of that cemetery, a family that had been so often scattered and diminished by grief during their years together. His gravestone is notably simple, understated in a way that seems almost surprising for a man who had spent so much of his life as a performer and public figure. It bears his name and dates with little further adornment, as though, in death, Samuel Clemens finally allowed himself the plain, unassuming rest that his restless, wandering, often difficult life had rarely afforded him. But if his grave was modest, his legacy was anything but, and it is to that vast and still growing legacy that we now turn, to understand fully why a boy from a tiny river town in Missouri came to be remembered as one of the essential voices of American literature. In the immediate aftermath of his death, tributes to Samuel Clemens poured in from around the world, and the sense that America had lost not merely a beloved humorist, but a genuinely significant literary figure, only grew stronger in the years that followed. Writers of the generation that came after him, including Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner, would later credit him with helping to establish an authentically American literary voice, one built on the actual rhythms of spoken language rather than borrowed European literary conventions. Hemingway's famous assertion that all modern American literature descends from Huckleberry Finn helped cement, for generations of readers and scholars, Clemens's central position in the American literary tradition. His influence extended well beyond the world of professional literature and into the broader currents of American culture. His autobiography, portions of which he had deliberately withheld from publication until a century after his death, believing that only such distance would allow him to speak with complete honesty, was finally published in full beginning in 2010, exactly on the schedule he had specified, and it became, remarkably, a bestseller more than 100 years after he wrote it, a testament to how thoroughly his voice continued to captivate readers long after his death. In the town of Hannibal, Missouri, the boyhood home that inspired Tom Sawyer's fictional St. Petersburg has been preserved and restored as a museum, drawing visitors from around the world eager to walk the same streets and see the same river that shaped the imagination of the young Samuel Clemens. Nearby stands a statue of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn together, cast in bronze, forever caught in the middle of some small adventure, a fitting tribute in a town that has built much of its modern identity around the memory of the barefoot boy who once ran wild along its streets and bluffs. The house in Hartford, Connecticut, where he wrote much of his greatest later work and raised his daughters before tragedy scattered the family's happiness, has similarly been preserved as a museum and national historic landmark, allowing visitors to stand in the very study where Adventures of Huckleberry Finn took its final shape. His name and image have become so thoroughly woven into American cultural consciousness that they appear in places far removed from literature itself. Schools, libraries, streets, and public institutions across the country bear his name or the name of his most famous characters. His image, the white suit, the wild white hair, the perpetual cigar, remains instantly recognizable more than a century after his death, appearing in countless illustrations, films, and popular references. Few writers from any era have achieved such lasting visual as well as literary recognition. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in particular has remained one of the most widely read, taught and debated novels in the American educational system, a position it has held for well over a century. Its unflinching portrayal of slavery's cruelty, combined with its use of period-accurate but deeply painful racial language, has made it a persistent subject of controversy, periodically challenged or banned from school curricula, even as many educators and literary scholars continue to defend it as an essential, morally serious work that confronts America's original sin with more honesty than most literature of its era attempted. This ongoing debate, rather than diminishing the novel's importance, has in some ways confirmed it, ensuring that new generations continue to grapple seriously with what Clemens was actually trying to say about human dignity, moral courage, and the corrosive hypocrisy of a society built on human bondage. His influence can also be traced through the writers who explicitly named him as inspiration across the 20th century and beyond. Beyond Hemingway's famous tribute, authors as varied as Sinclair Lewis, John Steinbeck, and Kurt Vonnegut acknowledged debts to his mixture of plain-spoken narration and moral seriousness, while humorists from Will Rogers to modern satirical writers and commentators have cited him as the figure who proved an American voice, unpolished and regionally accented, could carry as much literary weight as anything produced in London or Boston's more refined literary circles. His famous insistence on using the actual grammar and vocabulary of real, specific American communities rather than a flattened, idealized literary English opened a door that countless writers after him walked through, from the regional dialect fiction of the following decades to the vernacular voices that animate much of contemporary American fiction and memoir today. Beyond his novels, Clemens left behind an enormous body of shorter writing, essays, speeches, letters, and aphorisms, many of which have become so deeply embedded in everyday English that people quote them constantly without any awareness of their original source. Observations frequently attributed to him about the exaggerated reports of his own death, about the value of honesty, about travel broadening the mind, and about countless other subjects continue to circulate widely, some of them genuinely his, and others merely attributed to him by a popular culture eager to credit its favourite wit with any particularly sharp observation. A strange but fitting tribute to how completely his reputation for cleverness has outlived him. His influence reached beyond the borders of the United States as well. During his lifetime, he was celebrated across Europe, honoured with an honorary doctorate from Oxford University in 1907, a recognition of literary achievement that meant a great deal to a man who had never finished grade school. He travelled to England for the ceremony, delighted almost boyishly by the elaborate red and grey robes he was required to wear, and he wore that academic gown again on other formal occasions in the years that followed, plainly proud of an honour that stood in such striking contrast to his own truncated formal education. Friends noted that of all the accolades and honours that came his way over the decades, this particular recognition from one of the world's oldest and most prestigious universities seemed to touch him most deeply, a quiet vindication for the 11-year-old boy who had once been forced to leave school for good. Translations of his major works appeared in dozens of languages, and his particular blend of humour, humanity, and social criticism found admirers among readers and writers in cultures far removed from the Mississippi River Valley, where his own imagination first took root. Perhaps most significantly, Clemens helped permanently establish humour as a legitimate vehicle for serious literary and social commentary in American letters. Before him, humour writing was often dismissed as a lesser, merely entertaining genre, unworthy of serious critical attention. Clemens demonstrated through works like Huckleberry Finn that laughter and moral seriousness were not opposites, but could be woven together, that a reader could be entertained and challenged in the very same sentence, that satire could illuminate injustice as effectively as any solemn tract. This lesson, absorbed by generations of American writers, satirists and social commentators who followed him, remains perhaps his single most enduring contribution to the shape of American culture, still visible today in every corner of comedy, journalism and literature that dares to use laughter as a tool for truth. His works have never gone out of print since their original publication, a rare and telling distinction among authors of any era, one shared by only a small handful of writers across the entire history of English language literature. Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn have been adapted into countless films, stage productions, radio dramas, and television programs across more than a century, introducing new generations of children to the river, the raft, and the fence that never seemed to get whitewashed. Scholars continue to publish new critical studies of his work every year, examining his treatment of race, his complicated and evolving views on empire and colonialism as expressed in his later essays, his innovations in vernacular narration, and his lasting influence on the very sound of American prose, a body of scholarship that shows no sign of slowing more than a century after his death. His late life turn toward biting political and social criticism, once considered a minor footnote to his career as a humorist, has in recent decades received renewed attention and respect. Essays he wrote condemning American and European imperialism in places like the Philippines and the Congo, along with his sharp critiques of organized religion and unchecked capitalism, reveal a thinker whose moral seriousness ran every bit as deep as his gift for comedy, even if the public of his own time preferred to remember him primarily as an entertainer. Modern readers, encountering these darker, more overtly political writings for the first time, often find in them a startlingly contemporary voice, one unafraid to challenge the powerful institutions and comfortable assumptions of his day. The house at Hannibal, the house in Hartford, and his final home at Stormfield in Redding, Connecticut together draw hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, pilgrims of a sort, walking through the rooms where a poor boy's memories became a nation's shared literary inheritance, and where a wealthy, world-famous author quietly endured the private griefs that his public humour so often concealed. Annual festivals in Hannibal celebrate his memory with reenactments, fence whitewashing contests for children, and gatherings of scholars and enthusiasts from around the world, a living, ongoing tribute to a man who once feared, during his bankruptcy years, that his name might be remembered only for failure and debt, a fear that the enduring affection of these annual celebrations has long since laid to rest. Consider once more the paradox with which this story began. A boy who left school at 11, who never earned a formal diploma of any kind, became one of the most quoted and celebrated intellects of his age, honoured by Oxford University, sought out by presidents and royalty, his sentences memorised by schoolchildren who would never read another word of literature from his century. A man who failed repeatedly at business, who lost fortunes to failed inventions and bad investments, chose nonetheless to pay back every debt he owed, rather than accept the easier legal path available to him, and in doing so, earned a form of respect that no amount of wealth could have purchased. A humorist known the world over for his laughter, carried, beneath that laughter, a heart that had buried a son, 2 daughters, and a beloved wife, and somehow continued through all of it to find words that could make strangers smile. Samuel Langhorne Clemens once wrote that the 2 most important days in a person's life are the day they are born and the day they discover why. His own why revealed itself slowly, imperfectly, across a winding path that led from a printer's shop to a riverboat pilot house, from failed silver mines to a newspaper desk in Nevada, from the deck of a ship crossing the Atlantic to the quiet, difficult labour of finishing a novel about a boy and a raft and a river that never stopped moving. He gave the world, under a borrowed riverboat phrase meaning safe water, a body of writing that captured something essential and enduring about American life, its humour and its cruelty, its restless ambition and its capacity for tenderness, its unfinished struggle to live up to its own ideals. He showed, across the arc of his own difficult life, that grief and laughter are not opposites but close companions, that a person can carry deep sorrow and still offer the world genuine joy, that failure, faced honestly and repeatedly, does not disqualify a person from eventually finding the thing they were meant to do. Think of the boy standing on the banks of the Mississippi, watching the steamboats pass, dreaming of nothing grander than someday piloting one of those great vessels himself. He could not have known that the river he loved so simply would one day carry his stories to readers on every continent, that the small town he wandered so freely as a barefoot child would become a place of literary pilgrimage, or that the very phrase called out by leadsmen measuring safe water beneath a boat's hull would become one of the most recognized names in the history of the English language. There is something quietly comforting in that unlikely journey, a reminder that a life's true direction is rarely visible from its beginning, that the raw material of an ordinary childhood, its friendships, its small adventures, its unremarkable griefs, can become, in the right hands and across enough patient years, something lasting and true. He was not a perfect man, and he would likely have been the first to say so, with a laugh, before anyone else could get the words out. He held, for a time, views on race and other matters that reflected the limitations of his era, even as his own moral instincts, expressed most powerfully through Jim's humanity and Huckleberry Finn, pushed steadily against those very limitations across the course of his life. He struggled with money, with grief, with a temper that could flare as quickly as his humour, and with private doubts about faith and meaning that he rarely allowed the public to see. But he kept working, kept observing, kept turning his own hardships into words that might ease someone else's evening, right up until his final months, when even a failing heart could not entirely quiet the old, patient habit of reaching for a pencil and setting one more thought down before sleep. Finally, fully, came for him too. He came into the world alongside a comet blazing silently across the sky, and he left it the same way, 74 years later, having earned, through a lifetime of watching, listening, failing and trying again, the right to be remembered not simply as a humorist, but as one of the clearest and most honest voices his country ever produced. If there is one image worth holding on to as we close, let it be this: an old man in a white suit sitting on a porch, watching the sky for a comet he had told the world he was waiting for, entirely unafraid, entirely at peace with the strange symmetry of his own life. Let it be the image of a boy on a raft drifting quietly down a wide brown river under a full moon, in no particular hurry to arrive anywhere at all. Thank you for spending this time with the story of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, the boy from Hannibal who became Mark Twain. If this journey through his life brought you some measure of calm and some quiet company in the dark, consider following along for more stories like it, and share it with anyone who might enjoy drifting off to the quiet rhythm of a life well lived. Until next time, rest well. Good night.